Hello there, and welcome along to the Gardener Ben podcast. As we head towards the end of September and into the beginning part of October, it is time to start thinking about offering winter protection for frost-tender plants in the garden, like dahlias, calla lilies, and exotic plants like bananas. I grow lots of these types of things in the garden as I enjoy the drama they create during the high summer months. And as I sit in the dining room staring at a huge vase of cut dahlias from the vegetable and cutting garden, it seems almost a shame to be talking about putting these items to bed for the winter months. But this needs to be done relatively quickly. Many gardeners like to make a huge fuss about putting their dahlia tubers to bed for the winter months, but I like to keep my process relatively simple, and I'll explain why in just a few moments. I grow around 50 or 60 different varieties of dinner plate dahlia here at North Lodge, and I particularly like the dinner plates because I like them big and showy when you only need 3 or 4 stems to fill a vase. I often like to fill the entire fireplace here with different varieties, maybe a dozen at a time, to really show off the colour and form. Over many years I've collected quite a few in different styles, shapes and textures. I'm looking at a vase at the moment containing things like Kaz Cloud and Santa Claus, mixed with a tiny little pom-pom white dahlia, which is really lovely, called Aster's White. A really good dahlia for me this year has been Grand Finale, producing enormous cactus-style blooms, almost a foot across. Lifting and dividing dahlia tubers is, in my opinion, incredibly risky, and unless you're planning to sell tubers on to other people, I don't believe in dividing tubers at this stage during the storage process, and instead opt to leave mine over the winter in the ground where they're safest. Many will see this process as being lazy, but I see it as a way of protecting the tuber with everything that it has already in the ground around it. When I plant a dahlia tuber, if I have any to replace in the spring months, I always make sure that I plant them with a little bit of horticultural grit or sharp sand in the hole, which tends to protect them from the worst of the winter rotting. It's then a process of making sure you've planted them deep enough. Around a foot to 15 inches is normally ideal. Then, come the end of October, I'm ready with my mulch. I get at least 2 or 3 cubic metres of mulch delivered, and just before the first frost is due, I go around and mulch over the top of my dahlia beds, creating what can only be described as a series of large molehills. I tend to use a woodland mulch or a landscaper's bark with a large particle size, and I do this for a good reason. Not only does it have a large particle size, but it doesn't hold a great deal of moisture, and it has a nice loose and open texture, which means when piled up around a plant, it has an awful lot of air in it, which quite naturally acts as a nice warm woolly blanket. I create these molehills around 12 to 15 inches in diameter around the plant and around 6 to 8 inches deep, piling up the mulch around the stems. It's then a waiting game for the first frosts to come. As soon as the frost has blackened off the growth, I will remove this, leaving around 2 or 3 feet of the stem above ground. Dahlias, like other plants, such as bamboo, create hollow stems, often with breaks in their growth. So by leaving the growth above ground 2 or 3 feet tall, you stop an awful lot of the water heading down into the ground and possibly rotting the tuber. If you choose to use this technique for dahlias that you leave over winter in the ground, you can simply then peel back the mulch come around late March and early April to see whether your tubers have overwintered properly. Using this technique, I often lose around 5 to 7% of the dahlias left in the ground over the winter, which can be quite frustrating, but also is a wonderful opportunity to add new dahlias and different varieties to my collection. Adding new dahlias to my collection always starts in August and September when I visit a local dahlia nursery, and I strongly advise you to do this if you have a passion or an interest in the subject. Buying tubers online over the winter months can often feel quite rewarding, But it's also incredibly disappointing when you get to late July and early August and find that the dahlia tuber that you've purchased and had your heart set on is either incorrect or a completely different colour. If you have a local specialist grower like we do very close to us, it is always a really good idea to head over to the dahlia field if they have one available and spend an afternoon or morning walking around taking a look at the flowers. Our local nursery has nearly an acre of plants growing that you can also buy as cut flowers, but it's a wonderful opportunity to walk around the field, take dozens and dozens of pictures and allocate varieties that capture your attention. There's nothing better than seeing the flower in all of its glory, colour, form and texture, showing all of its true characteristics. I put these photographs into albums on my phone and correlate these into lists of plants that I want to buy, placing my order really early on in the season, often in very late October or the beginning of November, to make sure I guarantee myself the stock that I'm looking for. Dahlias purchased in this way at the beginning of the season don't instantly make it to my dahlia bed. These instead are started off in large pots, normally in a 5 or 7 litre container, something large enough to get the tuber going, but small enough to make sure that you can handle them properly without the root ball falling apart when it comes to planting. I always pre-prepare the pots with a layer of horticultural grit or sharp sand at the very bottom to make sure when the dahlia finally ends up in the ground, it has everything it needs during the bedding out process. They're started off in the greenhouse before being planted into large terracotta pots around the garden, and it's these that at the end of their first season I'll be lifting and storing, and I'm now going to talk you through my process. Once again, I don't understand why many gardeners decide to lift, divide and store their dahlias if they're not actually planning on selling the tubers. This to me represents a massive point of stress, and people are often incredibly disappointed after several weeks when their dahlia tubers rot or are eaten by pests. Mice and rats, for instance, are a huge problem when it comes to storing dahlia tubers, and if you get them too hot, they shrivel up and you can't rehydrate them, and if you keep them too cold, they're often frost damaged and completely turned to mush by the time you get round to planting them in March or April. When I've grown a dahlia in a large pot, I often lift them and dry them out completely, including their compost. All I do is simply take a border spade and lift them from their pots, making sure you've estimated exactly how large you think the tuber may be. On many that are into their second year, this is normally around 9 to 10 inches from where the stems originate from the ground itself. I lift these items and place them into a wheelbarrow before heading into the greenhouse. By this time in the year, I've normally cleared the tomatoes, aubergines, courgettes and other tender plants that I've been growing in the greenhouse, and it is now time to give the greenhouse a thoroughly good clean down. I place my dahlias complete with their compost on my greenhouse staging, and this is what I call their curing process. The idea of this is to leave them in the greenhouse for around 2 to 3 weeks to allow the compost to almost dry out. You don't want it bone dry, and you certainly don't want it sopping wet. What you want to do is create a lovely warm and woolly blanket around your dahlia tuber, which will naturally protect it from the elements before you actually go to storage. I leave my dahlia tubers in this state in the greenhouse in full sun with the vents open and exposed on the greenhouse staging for around 2 to 3 weeks before I move to the storage stage. Once this is done, I make sure that my labels are in place. This is really important whether you're overwintering in the ground or whether you're choosing to lift using this technique. Labelling is always key, as they are virtually impossible to tell the difference with when you just have foliage to work with, and leaving it 6 months to re-identify a plant that you've lost a label on can be incredibly frustrating for the organised gardener. Once the labelling is sorted out and the tuber and compost have virtually dried to they're almost dry to the touch, it's time to place them into food crates. I tend to use the ones that your online shopping gets delivered in. These are absolutely perfect as they have a multitude of holes and ventilations not only in the bottom but also in the sides. They're also fully stackable, so if like me you have a few to do, you can stack them up into a relatively small space. I line my trays with newspaper and then place them into a frost-free outbuilding up off the floor, always using an upturned crate as an almost airlock underneath my first crate before stacking up the others. I'm then, unlike an awful lot of other gardeners, incredibly bold and don't look at my tubers again until the end of the winter period. It's at this point, and only this point, that if I was going to divide a tuber that I particularly like, I would think about dividing them. If you go ahead and divide your tubers before storage, every time you make an incision, in my opinion, you're risking a point of rot and actually losing the tuber that you're trying to replicate and get more of, which in my opinion is a risky business. It's also time to start thinking about offering winter protection to exotic plants that you might be growing as well. Calla lilies can also be brought straight into the greenhouse or into a frost-free outbuilding just as soon as the growth has been blackened off by the first frost. Once again, I leave these items complete with their compost in a frost-free and dark environment. I also overwinter new season lilies exactly the same way. Ones that are purchased at horticultural shows towards the back end of June and into July will often not have made enough growth during the growing season to actually overwinter the bulb and reflower next year. So I keep these in large containers and move them into the greenhouse as soon as they finished flowering. Giving them an extra 5 or 6 weeks of growth often means the bulb has all the energy it needs to come back up next year before these items are bedded out in the main part of the garden. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this episode, I have a real passion for growing exotic plants as well, and every year choose to grow a series of bananas, which I keep in large decorative pots, often made out of strange items, like a dolly tub for instance, or a disused galvanised dustbin. Some of these stay outside for the winter taking their chances. Some are often too big to bring in. However, the summer of 2024 has been absolutely terrible, and my red banana, which is normally around 6 to 8 feet tall by this stage in the summer and has leaves probably around 3 feet long, is a tiny, tiny specimen. So instead of taking it into the greenhouse where it has the opportunity to overwinter and regrow for 2025, I will be actually moving this particular plant into the house for the winter season, and instead will be using it as a house plant, as it's only a little over 1.5 feet tall and 1.5 feet wide. Should your exotic banana plants be too large to bring into the house and use as a house plant, you can consider putting them to bed for the winter, and this is a complex process. It's also very, very brutal. Lift your banana from wherever you may have planted it and trim the roots back to around 6 to 12 inches in length. These are normally white and look a little bit like bindweed roots. Then you need to give the plant a thoroughly good wash, removing as much of the compost as possible. I normally lay the plant out on a disused vegetable bed for this, so the compost can just be incorporated back into the bed. It's now time to remove all of the leaves. This is brutal. All you need to do is leave the leaves in the very, very centre of the crown. These may continue to grow over the coming weeks before the plant goes into dormancy. The plant then needs to be dried out, and we do this by standing it up, upside down, on its head, allowing the excess water to drain out of the crown. Once the plant is dry, this normally takes around 10 to 14 days, it needs to be placed into a dark, frost-free place, somewhere like a shed, an outbuilding, or maybe even a outdoor store, somewhere that you're confident that the temperature will not drop below around 7 degrees. Your plant can be wrapped loosely in newspaper or Hessian sacking and remain like this for a good 4 or 5 months. In late February, it will be time to wake your plant up by removing it from its dark storage and potting it back up. Through experience, I found this is probably the most difficult part to get through. If you don't have somewhere that you can get enough heat behind the plant, It's normally at this stage where you unfortunately lose it. Which means over the last few years, I've almost given up using this technique, instead choosing to buy a brand new red banana every February or March, costing around £12, which I know sounds a little bit extravagant, but these grow incredibly quickly and reward you with an enormous plant by the end of the season. However, I found the heartbreak of losing them in February and March, when you spent the entire winter season looking after them, keeping them dry, and stopping the rats eating them, to be then rewarded by the fact they rot just before you actually get them to grow. Too much to bear. So instead, I've got into the habit of purchasing a new one and bedding it out by the 3rd or 4th week of May every year. As I mentioned at the very beginning of the introduction to the podcast, I'm regularly going to be taking questions from people, not only from the podcast itself, but also answering questions that I'm asked on my social media platforms. And this particular interesting question actually came in via YouTube. Obviously, you can find me using the handle _GardenerBen across all media platforms, so feel free to leave me a comment wherever you follow along. This particular question captured my attention, and it's how, as a gardener, you can adapt to climate change and what you can do to make sure that you have growing success every season. This is a particularly difficult subject, but I've been working around these things for the last few years, making sure that I'm adapting my gardening techniques and learning from my fails and, of course, from my successes every single year. I'm paying close attention to the garden at all times and making small adjustments wherever necessary. My largest piece of advice with this is to actually extend your growing season wherever possible. We found here on the south coast of England that sometimes the season starts incredibly early, which means the greenhouse needs to be opened up well ahead of schedule. But sometimes the season also changes quickly, so there's also a need to offer winter protection and bring things into the greenhouse well ahead of when they would normally happen. So my largest piece of advice is to really extend your growing season. You can do this by getting yourself a greenhouse, no matter how big or small. Mine actually came from FaceBay and was really cheap, under £100. The use of a cold frame or zip-up greenhouse grow tent can also be really useful, but don't underestimate the power that a garage or shed or covered carport can also give you if you're needing winter protection to keep tender plants safe from the frost, even for very short periods of time. I'm also listening to other gardeners and paying attention on the internet, changing the varieties of vegetables and flowers that I grow, and slowly removing varieties of roses from the garden that have been discontinued or retired because they no longer really suit the climate that they're growing in here in the UK. If you have a question, or if there's something that you'd like me to talk about on a future episode, don't hesitate to drop me a comment underneath this particular podcast, or a comment on any one of the posts on social media. You can find me using TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Threads and YouTube, all using the same handle, _GardenerBen. On next week's podcast, we're going to be talking about winterizing the garden ahead of the autumn and winter months and getting things ready for planting season. Bare root rose season is here, and it is my absolute favourite time to get moving in the garden and getting lots and lots done. Much as I don't like to clear too much foliage away, I do like to start planning for the next season ahead. I'm one of those gardeners that's been paying close attention to all of the plants and how things have performed over the spring and summer so far. And I'm a great believer, if something doesn't bring you joy, it's time to start thinking about moving it on, even if that plant was a firm favourite a few years ago. So I like to start thinking about what I'm going to do, removing any plants from the garden that may have failed or that no longer bring me a great deal of pleasure, and think about replacing them. Autumn is by far the best window to be planting things, especially bare root roses. Make the most of this lovely, warm and especially wet planting season. Roses planted over this particular period as we run up to Christmas will establish themselves really quickly and get themselves ready to be growing away happily for the next spring and summer season. Thank you so much for joining me on episode 2 of the Gardener Ben podcast. I'll be back again next week. See you all soon. Take care now. Bye-bye.